Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show here on ChannelOne television. On The Point of View, we pick the right topics, get the right guests, and ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. We have a two-in-one show for you tonight. We're reflecting on the very sad occurrences around the 6th of February when a 29-year-old engineer died in an ambulance following the refusal of 3 of Ghana's key Accra hospitals from receiving him when he was in distress. We'll be discussing how to improve our national emergency response from the perspective of a person who works as a paramedic in an ambulance and also from a doctor's perspective. Later on, we speak to the CEO of Goldfields Group. They released their results for 2025, and I'll be speaking to the Chief Executive Officer later on in the show. We're interactive. We'll be back with the details. Stay with us. So a few weeks ago, the nation woke up to the sad story of a 29-year-old man whose family declared him missing because they hadn't found him for a couple of days. It was later found out that he had been killed by a motorbike that knocked him. He had been rescued by the ambulance service, tried to essentially save him. It did not work. Let's take you quickly into that to give you a sense of what happened before we speak to our guest in studio.
On Friday, 6th February, a 29-year-old Charles Emisa died following a hit-and-run crash at the Circle Overpass in Accra after reportedly being turned away by 3 major hospitals due to the unavailability of bed space. The victim was an engineer at Pomisado Ghana Limited. At 10:32 p.m., the ambulance service received a walk-in alert about the incident. According to the service, the crew mobilized a minute later and arrived at the scene 3 minutes later, where Emisa was found lying supine on the road with profuse bleeding. At 10:40 p.m., the ambulance departed for Police Hospital, arriving 3 minutes later. The facility reportedly declined to admit Emisa, citing no available beds. Even the offer to use the ambulance trolley was reportedly rejected. The crew then transported the patient to Ridge General Hospital, arriving at 10:58 p.m., where he was again refused admission. At 11:20 p.m., the ambulance reached Kolebu Teaching Hospital. Staff there allegedly instructed the crew to continue to the University of Ghana Medical Center. While still at Kolebu, Emisa's condition deteriorated and he went into cardiac arrest. CPR was administered immediately but was unsuccessful. A doctor on duty later certified him dead and instructed the ambulance crew to convey the body to the mortuary. The EMS team transported the body at 12:50 a.m., handing it over to the appropriate authorities at 12:53 a.m. The Deputy Director of the Ambulance Service, Simon Yusuf Kibra, confirmed the sequence of events to City News. He also lamented the negative impact of the no-bed syndrome on their work. He further called on health authorities to find lasting solutions to the challenge.
So everything brought down to the no-bed syndrome. So it's something that we are facing. But this particular issue is an emergency case that happened at a spot, and we need immediate attention. We don't provide holistic medical care. First is to provide in hospital, so ensure that the person gets to a facility for further treatment. So if we get on there's no bed, in fact, it makes our work very less. So we always appeal, we want the government to at least a percentage of at the emergency ward.
There are also reports that some of these hospitals deliberately refuse to accept the person due to the condition of the person and not necessarily because they aren't bed. Has that come to the attention of the ambulance service as well?
That's one, I cannot establish that. And then because of all this, that is why the minister has established and has formed a committee to look into this matter.
So to break down what happened and also what we can do as a nation for this type of no-bed situation never to repeat itself, I have in the studio Martin Ewuah Amoah, who is the Clinical Auditor Southern Zone for the National Ambulance Service. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So you're a Clinical Auditor, but you're actually a paramedic too.
Yes, a paramedic by profession, but my job assignment in the National Ambulance Service is a clinical auditor.
A clinical auditor. I'm sure you explained that.
Yes.
Thank you. We also have Nana Gansa Dazi, who's I call him a public health intellectual, but he's a medical doctor, but he helps us a lot with some of his advocacy within the public sphere, and indeed he's contributed to some of the work Occupy Ghana has been doing when it comes to public health in Ghana. Nana, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening.
Wonderful. I don't know if I described you correctly. I say you're a public intellectual in the health space, although you're a doctor as well, because of all your writings. Is that a good description?
Maybe.
Wonderful.
I'm first and foremost just a clinician, so.
Wonderful. I remember in 2018 when a 70-year-old man died after 7 hospitals refused him. You helped us craft a very important petition to the then president. At the time, there were only 54 ambulances in Ghana. To think that now we have over 300 and people are still dying from no bed syndrome, I'm sure you must be wondering how are we still at this stage?
It's not surprising because we haven't done all the things we need to do.
We'll get into the details shortly. Let me start with so just to be clear, how many staff and ambulances do we have? What is the sort of the strength of our national ambulance system?
All right, thank you for that question. So we have a staff strength close to 4,000 currently, and the National Ambulance Service operates the Anglo-American system of EMS, which involves what we call the scoop and run system. So the scoop and run system is such a way that when you are called to an emergency, the emergency medical technicians or paramedics, when they get on scene, they take care of the initial stabilization of the patient, not just scooping and running, but they take care of the initial stabilization of the patient, i.e. includes like bleeding control procedures, oxygen administration, and several immobilization of fractures, several procedures, CPR, performing CPR on patients in cardiac arrest, and make sure that you stabilize the patient and you initiate transport to definitive care.
Amazing.
For that patient.
So how many people would be manning one ambulance unit?
So ideally we are supposed to have like 3 personnel or practitioners on board, including the driver, who is equally an EMT trained to give care to patients. So ideally we have 3 personnel on board, but at the minimum you have 2 personnel.
And the driver will always be a paramedic as well?
Yes, also a paramedic trained.
As well. So how many ambulances do you have in Ghana?
Currently we have 318 stations, but currently we have 191 in commission.
191
in commission and our 127 out of commission.
So 127 are not working?
Yes, obvious reason, because the ambulance has a lifespan of 5 years. So
and they've been in operation some since 2019, some since 2020?
Yes, so after 5 years, there should be steps to replace those ambulances. Else, like any other vehicle, high maintenance issues or cropping, if you are not able to get a new fleet to replace the old ones.
So we have 191 official ambulances
out of commission temporarily. Some may be permanent, but some are temporary. So
you said 127 are not working?
Are not.
But 191 are working?
Are functional.
Are working.
Functional as we speak today.
What must a functional ambulance have?
Yes, functional ambulance should have at the minimum a stretcher, wheel stretcher, where you put the patient to perform procedures on the patient. You should have at least an oxygen delivery system on board. You should have some basic stabilization tools like immobilization equipments. You should have an AED to resuscitate somebody who goes into cardiac arrest. We have airway agents to help stabilize someone's airway, especially an unconscious patient, to make sure that the person is able to maintain an airway. So you should have basic life supporting equipment on board. That makes it an ambulance and differentiates it from any other vehicle, because when a person is assumed that when somebody is picked in an ambulance, the person is given some level of care depending on the type of staff that you have on board. as I started by saying earlier, we have different levels of training. You have the emergency medical technicians. We have the advanced emergency medical technician level, and we have the paramedic level. We have 3 levels. So depending on the quality, the kind of staff that you have on board the ambulance will determine how more equipment that you need to add on. So the sophistication of the equipment will depend on the kind of procedures that can be performed on that particular type of ambulance.
I see. And so you yourself, what are you?
So I am a paramedic. I'm a paramedic by training. I trained in the United States of America, specifically Florida. Currently, the country is not running a paramedic program in the country. So for somebody to be able to practice as a paramedic, you need to go outside and study there and come back.
So you're a paramedic?
I'm a paramedic by
training. So which means you can man an ambulance unit?
Yes, I do man an ambulance unit.
All right. You described what was in an ambulance, and that an ambulance is not just pick people and send them to a place. It's a health system and a unit. So that's different from a taxi conveying somebody to a hospital.
Exactly.
But beyond that, how do you work generally when you pick somebody up and the person is distressed, maybe bleeding, and you stabilize the person? What do you do?
All right. So the EMS structure is made up of what we call the dispatch center. You have the dispatch center where the calls come in of emergency, a distress call received from people, and once that call is received, the dispatcher will give some we call advanced directives to those people concerned. If somebody is having a challenge or ill health, the dispatcher has ability. The dispatchers are also equally trained as emergency medical technician. They have the capacity to give you some guidelines to stabilize the scene before they attach an ambulance to that particular call. So yes, when the ambulance receives or a particular station is attached to a call, they respond and get to the scene. When they get to the scene, they ensure safety of the scene. They assess the patient, see what is going on with the patient, then initiate initial interventions to stabilize the patient. Then ultimately the patient has to be transported to a hospital for definitive treatment.
All right. Do you, as a team, when you stabilize a patient and determine that the patient needs further treatment, do you have to establish contact with a health facility in situ prior to moving to the facility?
Yes, so that is part of our operations. You are supposed to alert the receiving facility that you intend to send the patient to, so that primarily for them to be prepared to receive that patient. So when you look at the 2012 referral guidelines, it's from the Ministry of Health, you see that no patient should, with an emergency, should be refused care without first being given any kind of first aid or that matter. So basically they are supposed to receive any patient that you bring in with any kind of condition, any ill health or any kind of injury. But the issue is they need to first, you need to ensure that they are prepared ahead of your coming. You need to inform the facility that you intend to transport the patient to, so that they will have the relevant professionals on board ahead of your arrival at the facility.
So you definitely have to call them ahead of time or make contact with them in some way.
Yes.
Before you set off.
If the network allows. But you know, we are all aware that in some parts of this country, you try to make calls and might not go through. And at that moment, the question is, what do? You can only do the initial stabilization and transport to definitive care. So at the end of the day, the question is, do the facilities have to accept when the cases are brought in? But as I said earlier, the referral policy from the Ministry of Health in 2012 makes it very clear that every emergency should, first of all, be not be turned away without first establishing or giving some first aid of a sort to that patient before.
And lastly, before I come to Nana, Dr. Nana, are there a list of facilities that can receive emergency cases, or can you decide to send them to the nearest hospital? How does it work?
All right, so basically we are supposed to do the initial stabilization when you get on scene and transport the patient to the closest appropriate facility. So all the EMTs or emergency medical technicians within a particular jurisdiction have an idea of the facilities that have the various capabilities. So for instance, if I'm working in Greater Accra, I know the facility that can have an emergency surgery done on a patient. So if I pick a patient who is in need of that urgent care, I know that this is where I have to route this patient to. So we have a fair idea. Every emergency medical technician within a particular area is conversant with the various facilities around within their catchment area and the capabilities.
Which means you would also have a working relationship with those facilities.
Yes.
They would know, because if I'm an ambulance based in Mampong, I would know the hospital, the biggest hospital there, because we've probably worked. So we know each other.
Definitely.
We are not strangers.
Definitely, because when you talk about the EMS setup, the EMS includes the dispatcher, it includes what you call the first responder system, which fortunately the government of the day has been able to train the latter part of last year, middle of last year to the end of last year, train 6,000 what we call community medical first responders, which is generally referred to as first responders. So what they do is they are within the communities where they are, when there are any emergencies, they will just initiate the initial first aid procedures, awaiting for the ambulance to arrive. Once the ambulance arrives, they hand over the patient to the ambulance crew, and the ambulance crew continues from there, and they give care as they transport the patient to the closest appropriate facility. And it includes the staff of the emergency department.
Okay.
The EMS setup includes the staff of the emergency department. So,
All right.
yes.
Now, sir, I want to run through quickly the situational report of the road traffic crash that occurred on the 6th of February. The reason I don't want to ask Mr. Amoah to comment is I don't want him to be a judge in his own court. This was obviously produced by people who work within his organization. But I'm just going to read it to remind viewers of what happened, and also just take your general thoughts as a clinician on what happened, and then we can get into some specific recommendations. So the details will be put on the screen, but basically at 22:32, ambulance 15 received a walk-in call to attend to an emergency road traffic crash at the Circle Overpass. A minute later, the ambulance mobilized to the scene. That's 22:33. 22:35, ambulance arrives at the scene. So that's 3 minutes between the walk-in call and the arrival. At the same 35, Charlie Watch crew responded to a suspected, at the time I thought it was 48-year-old male trauma patient involved in a motor crash, hit and run, they describe it. A minute after, the crew made contact with the casualty. Upon arrival, patient was found lying supine on the road with a profuse bleeding from a deep shoulder laceration. Initial assessment was done. They give the details, pulse, everything else. And then they described the intervention. EMS crew controlled bleeding using a gauze bandage, applied a cervical collar, log rolled the patient onto a spine board, and loaded him into the ambulance. Oxygen therapy was initiated via nasal prongs at 4 liters per minute. Vital signs were monitored every 5 minutes. So this is 22:36. By 22:40, ambulance mobilized with patient to police hospital. So that's just 4 minutes later. 22:43, 3 minutes later, they arrived at police hospital, but patient was rejected due to unavailability of beds. Crew offered the use of the ambulance trolley. However, staff stated there was no space within the facility. So this is 43. 22:53, 10 minutes later, crew mobilized to reach General Hospital. 22:58, crew arrives at Reed Medical Hospital. Patient was again rejected for the same reason as above. 23:15, 17 minutes later, crew mobilized to Kolebu Teaching Hospital. 23:20, 5 minutes after they mobilized, arrived at Kolebu. Patient was rejected and crew advised to continue transport to UGMC. Due to the deterioration of the patient's condition, the crew objected to further transportation and explained that continued movement could place the patient in a dangerous situation. Despite several negotiations, the patient was still refused. No hospital staff attended to the casualty, nor were vital signs taken. The crew continued monitoring the patient for approximately 30 minutes. during which the patient went into cardiac arrest. Cardiopulmonary resuscitation was immediately initiated but yielded no positive outcome. The patient presented with fixed dilated pupils, cold skin temperature, and showed no signs of life despite several resuscitation attempts. Then they mentioned a doctor who was on duty came to certify the patient dead and instructed the crew to convey the body to the mortuary. And of course, EMS crew mobilized, sent the patient to the mortuary, and the rest is history. I'm reading this not to distress the family, but it's a public interest matter, and I believe that if we don't go through our systems, we will not improve. And I'm asking you, as somebody who's been very interested in this, listening to this, what are your initial thoughts? What are your reflections?
I first want to say thank you to Mr. Amoah and all the work he's doing. Working as an EMS in Ghana, it's not easy. I'm an anesthesiologist, so I kind of know what he does. To be honest, it's indefensible. It really, really is indefensible. You can make as many excuses as you want about lack of beds, lack of equipment, lack of morale, apathy, but that's a human life. A 29-year-old, and hour and a half, that guy could have been saved. And it could have been something as simple as a tension pneumothorax that killed him. And all he needed maybe was a needle into his chest to release the air. It could have been, it was salvageable. 1.5 hours, something could have been done for him. And even if something was done and he didn't make it, you can argue that they tried, but it's really indefensible. As a physician, I can't defend this.
When you look at the conduct of the EMS team, the ambulance team, and based on the report they've given, was that standard from, as a clinician, just reading what they've written? If it's true, would you say that they acquitted themselves well?
Oh yes, they did. I mean, Bernard, if you look back 8 years ago where we were with 54 ambulances, I mean, if you look at the timeline, I was shocked when I read that there was an ambulance close to Circle and they responded in the time they did. I was blown away. And they acquitted themselves really, really well. And the guy had polytrauma. So polytrauma is where you often see that in car accidents, where you have several injuries. The guy had polytrauma. There was very little they could have done for him. You know, he could have died from several things: bleed in his head, torn vessels in his chest, a hole in his lung that causes what we call a tension pneumothorax. He could have ruptured his spleen. He could have ruptured his liver. He could have been bleeding profusely somewhere in his body. There was nothing they could have done but try to get him to the best place for care, which they did. You look at the timeline, I mean, they hustled to save this guy's life. And I mean, they can really feel happy about what they did and how they tried to save this guy.
So when we started this advocacy 8 years ago, we had only 54 ambulances. Obviously, the government procured about 307. Now we have 191. It seems to me as if a functioning emergency system is much more than having a lot of ambulances. Okay, so can you just walk me through a bit? When we say a functioning emergency system, what are its components? Just basic. What should it have?
So the emergency, I call it emergency response service, right? So it's massive if you really think of it. You cover medical emergencies, but you also cover something like crashes. Think of the helicopter crash that took the life of all those statesmen. It covers natural disasters. So it encompasses all these disasters, external and internal, that can affect the society. Now, that's really, really broad. And when we bring it down to the medical system, you need the ambulances, and you need the hospitals that would take care of these cases, and you need the EMTs and the paramedics who would take care of these patients at the initial point. But most important thing is you need a brain for this system, what I call a command center. And that is what it's lacking as we try to improve.
So the command center would, let's take the case of this poor gentleman who passed. The paramedics get there, they look at this patient. From their training, they recognize immediately this is a polytrauma. So they need to get this patient to a hospital which can deal with polytrauma, because you are dealing with like you can tell, an hour, 2 hours, right? So then they call the command center. This is unit, whatever. We had Seco with a gentleman who was hit by a car. It's a polytrauma. Where can we take him? The command center has a list of hospitals that can deal with polytrauma and the beds they have. And they reach out to that hospital. We have a polytrauma coming from Seco. Can you take him? And they said, yes, we can. Or we can't. Try this other place. And so they try, let's say, hospital B, which let's say, Ray says, oh, yes, we can take him. But we want Kolibu to take 2 of our patients who are recovering. So Kolibu says, okay. So they make beds free, and this patient ends up in Ridge. That is that little piece that is missing, that command center bed, right? And just like we've improved quite a bit with ambulances, that command center would take us another step up. And I think that is what the government should really, really concentrate on now. There's another thing that I would want to talk about, but we can reach that later.
Yes, so you're saying that the brain of the service is a center that can see facilities, beds available, and sort of match demand with supply. That's the kind of thing you're talking about.
Exactly. Now also, another step would be centers of excellence, right? So you have the command center, that is sort of the brain of the action. But you also have centers of excellence, and this is what I mean. You couldn't take this gentleman from one hospital to the next. He needed to go to a center that could treat polytrauma. He needed to go quickly, right? So it would be good to have a center for polytrauma, so the paramedics know where to take him exactly and immediately. You could have a center for heart attacks and strokes. So then they know, as soon as they see this patient is having a heart attack, they go there, they call the command center directs them there immediately. You could have a center for poisoning. So when you have a patient who you think may be poisoned, you take them there immediately. You have a center for obstetric care. So you have a patient who you think is having an obstetric emergency, you take them there immediately. So this is another consideration. The third one, and Mr. Amoah will probably agree with me, as what are emergencies, right? So emergency endangers your life or your limb. And there are a lot of people walking into accident emergencies across the country who really don't belong there, right? And so creating these centers would also allow these hospitals to tease out these cases that don't really fit there into lesser hospitals. So they free space and beds for the true emergencies, of which we have quite a few.
This is the point of view. We are reflecting on the very sad death of a 29-year-old engineer whose death has shocked the nation and also led to 2 inquiries. The Ministry of Health say they are investigating how 3 hospitals refused them treatment. The Health Facilities Regulatory Authority, HEFRA, have also instituted an investigation. I am in studio with Martin Ewuah Amoah, who is a clinical auditor in the Southern Zone. He's a paramedic. And I also have Nana Dazi Gansa on the show. We'll be right back. Stay with us.